Hello. We are still talking about civil rights, and we are still in the Prentice Hall United States History Modern America textbook. You can find a more updated version of this at the National Emergency Archives or the National Emergency Library. We're going to be talking about the movement gaining ground. So, why it matters. Despite the Brown decision and other civil rights victories, little changed in the everyday lives of most African Americans. Nonetheless, activists continued to struggle for civil rights. In the early 1960s, the movement experienced a groundswell of support. This surge produced a dramatic shift in race relations, led to the passage of landmark civil rights legislation in 1964, and set the stage for future reforms. So, focus question as we're reading this chapter: how did the civil rights movement gain ground in the 1960s? Student activists make a difference. After the Brown decision, many black youths expected that their schools would integrate quickly and that other racial reforms would follow. Change was not quick to come. However, disappointed with the lack of progress, young African Americans began to challenge segregation with new vigor and determination. Sit ins challenged segregation. On February 1st, 1960, four African American college students ordered donuts and coffee at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. As they expected, the white waitress refused to serve them. In the South, nearly all restaurants that served whites refused to serve blacks. To protest this discrimination, the four students sat down on the stools at the lunch counter where they stayed until closing time. Word of the Greensboro sit-in spread rapidly, sparking a new wave of similar protests across the nation. In Nashville, Tennessee, for example, students led by the Reverend James Lawson staged sit-ins and later marches to protest racial inequality. Elsewhere, protesters held wade-ins at public beaches and read-ins at public libraries, refusing to leave beaches or libraries reserved for whites only. Other activists carried picket signs and demonstrations and wrote letters to newspapers and government officials to express their support of the protests in the South. The SNCC promotes nonviolent protest. The sit-ins marked the birth of a new militancy, especially among young African Americans. To build on the momentum they gained, about 175 students from 30 states met at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. There, on Easter weekend in 1960, they listened to James Lawson deliver an inspiring address. We who are demonstrators are trying to raise what we call the moral issue. That is, we are pointing to the viciousness of racial segregation and prejudice and calling it evil or sin. We are also asserting get moving. The pace of change is too slow. At this rate, it will be another generation before the major forms of segregation disappear. Most of us will be grandparents before we can live normal human lives. This is James Lawson from A Lunch Counter Stool, 1960. Ella Baker, a veteran of the struggle for civil rights, had organized the meeting. The granddaughter of enslaved African Americans, Baker had been active in the NAACP and the SCLC. She helped the young activists to establish a new civil rights organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC. Its goal was to create a grassroots movement that involved all classes of African Americans in the struggle to defeat white racism and to obtain equality. Checkpoint. How did young people energize the civil rights movement in the 1960s? They energized the movement by holding sit-ins and marches and gathering together and protesting together. Riding for freedom. The next battleground was interstate transportation. Activists targeted this industry because they knew that travel between states was subject to federal rather than state regulation. In fact, the Supreme Court had recently ruled in Boynton v. Virginia that segregation on interstate buses and in waiting rooms was illegal. Civil rights activists were now going to test the federal government's willingness to enforce the law. Freedom riders face angry mobs. In the spring of 1961, CORE staged a freedom ride through the Deep South. Riders set off in two separate buses from Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans. En route, they defied segregationist codes. African Americans sat in the front of the bus and used white restrooms and bus stations. In Alabama, the trip took a dangerous turn. After departing from Anniston, pro-segregationists firebombed one of the buses. When the second bus arrived in Birmingham, a white mob attacked the riders. President Kennedy takes action. Photographs of the bombed-out and injured riders appeared in newspapers and on television screens around the world, prodding President John F. Kennedy to intervene. Kennedy had intervened before. The previous year, when he was running for the presidency, Kennedy had helped to win Martin Luther King's release from a Georgia prison after state officials had sentenced King to 6 months in jail for a traffic violation. King was freed, and Kennedy, with the help of African American voters, went on to win the presidential election of 1960. Kennedy now took action to stem the violence against the Freedom Riders. His administration worked out a deal with Mississippi's leaders. Police and state troopers agreed to protect the riders. The Federal Transportation Commission also issued an order mandating the desegregation of interstate transportation. In exchange, the Kennedy administration agreed not to intervene when Mississippi authorities arrested the activists and sentenced them to jail for disturbing the peace. The Freedom Riders achieved their immediate goal. They compelled a reluctant federal government to act. By refusing to allow mobs to deter them, the riders also displayed that intimidation would not defeat the movement. So, what did the Freedom Rides accomplish? They forced the federal government to really stand up and take action on what they said that they would take action on. The federal government said that interstate travel had to be desegregated. It wasn't being desegregated, so they forced the issue and made the federal government take a stand on the segregation issue in interstate travel. And that wraps up what we're going to talk about for today, but we will be continuing on with talking about these ideas in the civil rights movement in the next couple videos. Until then, stay safe, and I hope to see you soon.